everybody. My name is Carly Keene. I'm a communications coordinator and program manager for the Maryland LTAP Center. I'd like to introduce Ron Eck, our presenter today. Ron is a traffic engineer who's worked in the area of pedestrians and accessibility for many years and is currently the director of the West Virginia LTAP. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ron.
Thank you, Carly. Thank you, Alexis. Welcome, everyone. Pleased everyone signed up for the session here on ADA and temporary traffic control. You have my email address there. Feel free to contact me that way after the session if you have any concerns or questions about the topic. Do a quick overview here of what we'll talk about for the next 45 minutes or so. I'll give you a little bit of background and introduction to the topic and the kind of the legal basis for what we're going to be talking about. We'll talk a little bit about accommodating pedestrians in temporary traffic control, but I hope to spend most of our time on looking at the components of an accessible, detectable temporary path, and then we'll wrap up with some best practices and also some not so good practices. And then I have just some examples at the end, depending how much time we have to go through and discuss and get your comments. And throughout, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat box and Carly will let me know when we have questions or comments. The basis for what we're talking about this morning in this session is the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. This summer in July was the 30th anniversary of ADA. So there's increased interest in ADA and in municipal compliance with ADA. One thing to keep in mind, ADA is a civil rights law. So it's a little different than the law that we're maybe used to dealing with in public works, which tends to be tort law, where people make a claim because they suffered injury or property damage. But civil rights law means that we need to provide equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities so that they can access the same facilities, programs, and services as an able-bodied individual. You'll see this acronym maybe throughout the day. US DOJ, of course, that's the United States Department of Justice. They have the ultimate compliance responsibility. And the bottom line of what ADA calls for is that all programs and new and altered facilities, regardless of the funding source, must be accessible. And notice I've highlighted altered because would we agree that a work area on a sidewalk, whether it's, say, the gas company's replacing a section of gas pipeline, or it's the Public Works Department replacing a sidewalk slab, or maybe a property owner has part of a sidewalk downtown shifted a little bit because they're doing some facade work on a building, that has altered the sidewalk or the walkway. And of course, as I just said, under ADA, those altered facilities still have to be accessible. The specific element of ADA that we're going to be talking about today is PROAG, the Public Rights of Way Accessibility Guidelines. It addresses accessibility in the public right of way. So sidewalks along a street, crosswalks, traffic signals, those things that you all deal with probably on a daily basis, that's the public right of way. As the third bullet indicates there, PROAG is not yet law. It's still undergoing the rulemaking process. We're operating under the 2011 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. But a number of agencies, both state and local governments around the country, have adopted PROAG, even though it's not yet law at the federal level. And the recommendation of the two agencies whose logos I have there, the United States Department of Justice and the United States DOT, they endorse PROAG and recommend that we be using it. And in fact, in recent years, the courts around the country, through some of their rulings, have also said that agencies should be using PROAG. So even though it's not yet, quote, law, my recommendation is that agencies should be following PROAG when it comes to accessibility and the public right of way. Notice PROAG in one of their advisories says that temporary routes are alterations to an existing pedestrian environment, which I just mentioned. And this is what we need to do. We need to achieve the maximum accessibility feasible under existing conditions. And that's if DOJ was ever called in because of a complaint was filed or something like that, that's the bottom line that they would look at. Did the agency make the facility or the temporary traffic control area, was it accessible to the maximum extent feasible? And notice I took this photograph in Vermont a couple years ago, a couple summers ago. Obviously, this arrangement is not accessible to someone in a wheelchair. I think if you look closely, you'll agree there's some safety issues there as well. So this would not comply with the elements of PROAG. There's also, we'll talk today about what's called the alternate pedestrian access route. When a path is closed temporarily, there has to be an alternate pedestrian access route that is accessible. And I'm not going to read all of that or refer to all those citations to the MUTCD, but my point is, not only do we need to follow PROAG, but also work closely with the MUTCD. So these are the two documents or guidelines, if you will, that we need to be aware of and follow when we're dealing with temporary traffic control in the public right of way. And of course, part 6 of the MUTCD talks about the needs and control of all road users, and they specifically mention pedestrians with disabilities. And also this is not just something that's nice to do. Notice that it says it shall be an essential part of maintenance or construction or utility work. So it is a requirement under the MUTCD. I apologize for these not matching up too well, but originally I didn't intend to take 2 photographs. But this is Canal Street in New Orleans. Maybe some of you have been there. Obviously a popular tourist destination. The French Quarter is off to the upper left, a very popular part of the city, of course. You can see some older buildings. There's great restaurants on Canal Street. You can see some high-rise 30 to 40-story hotels. You can see a wide sidewalk because there's a lot of pedestrian traffic on Canal Street, especially during conventions and special events and so forth. But I was down there a couple years ago for a conference, and I was out walking, just taking photographs like I do. I came upon this work area. I believe they had gutted an old building here and were reconfiguring it to some newer use, a restaurant or a boutique hotel, or doesn't matter what it was. But notice the sidewalk is completely blocked with materials that they're storing there. It looks like there's even some materials in what had been the parking lane originally, and maybe the contractors, one of their pickups is here. But also notice they've taken one lane of Canal Street. Canal Street is a divided roadway. There's multiple lanes in one direction, then there's the median, which you can see has the famous streetcars in it, and then the other direction of traffic is on the other side of the median. But they've taken one lane of Canal Street for, looks like, parking their construction-related vehicles. I was focused originally on this yellow caution tape, which is an issue because that is not a detectable barricade for someone with a vision impairment. But as I was focused on that, taking a picture, the woman that you see here on the left walked by, and as best I could tell, she was a sighted, able-bodied pedestrian. But because there's no alternate pedestrian access route, notice where she's headed. She's about to turn the corner around that channelizing device there, tubular marker, and she's going to be walking in Canal Street with her back to traffic. To me, that's a safety issue. But think about, say, someone in a wheelchair who got to this point. They're not able to negotiate the curb here, so they can't get into the street. They would have to go back to the corner and find a way around this location. So the point is, this is poorly handled from both a safety and an accessibility standpoint. So what we're talking about today, these requirements apply to all temporary traffic control zones, whether it's by a state or local road agency. You can construction or maintenance contractors, both for roadway and building construction. I call it vertical construction. Utility companies, landscaping companies, plus any sort of sidewalk closure for building construction activities like we just saw. And it can range from closing a sidewalk where maybe you're just working on one slab of a sidewalk or replacing it, to major projects like you saw there in New Orleans, where the entire sidewalk on one side of the street was shut down probably for many months for that project. I talk about accessible and detectable. So before we get too far into this, we probably should talk about what are the definitions, or what do I mean by each of these. By accessible, I mean a pathway that pedestrians can safely reach, enter, and travel through to the end of the work zone. So there's curb ramps to allow them to move between the sidewalk and the street. There's sufficient turning space. Is that, for example, that motorized scooter that you see there in the image, that can't turn on a dime. That takes some number of feet to be able to turn right or left. And so there needs to be turning space. And very importantly, too, there needs to be a smooth, stable, non-slip surface, such as that concrete sidewalk you see in the image there, that someone in a wheeled device or other assistive device can travel on relatively easily. So that's what we mean by accessible. Detectable means there needs to be a continuous edge so that the vision impaired, especially the blind pedestrians who are using a cane, can detect that. And I know this is a static photo, but most of you have probably seen a blind pedestrian like the individual shown here. She will move that cane in an arc in front of her, maybe 3 feet or so in extent, touching the ground periodically, or maybe most of the time. It varies with individuals. But what they are looking for is what they call a shoreline. And for example, this low wall here, or high curb, whatever we want to call it, that is a shoreline. She can detect that with her cane, and that will help her keep a straight line as she's walking down that sidewalk. The other shoreline probably on this image is not visible, but out here in the lower right would probably be the curb between the sidewalk and the street. Curbs are a good thing for the visually impaired. They can detect those. Obviously, though, a curb is a barrier for a wheelchair, but the curb that would be here would be another part of the shoreline. That's a detectable feature. So let me show you this image. This is a work area. Could be any town, USA, probably. The actual work is going on behind the trees here. The sidewalk on this next block is closed, and you can see it looks like part of the travel way is also closed. But this is what the contractor or the agency did. They erected a sign here, crosswalk sign. I think you can see they've painted a temporary mid-block crosswalk here. So they want pedestrians to cross to the left from this viewpoint and then walk on the other side of the street. But based on what I just talked about, think about that. Is this detectable? No, certainly a blind pedestrian walking down this sidewalk has no clue that this sign is here. So this is a PROAG violation. There needs to be some sort of detectable barricade here to close off the sidewalk and direct the pedestrian toward the street. But is it accessible? Well, this bare earth is not an accessible surface. It might be traversable by a wheelchair today in this dry condition we see here, but when it gets wet or in the wintertime, the soil freezes and then thaws, that's not traversable. So this is not an accessible route. Also significantly, it does not appear to have a curb ramp here. So even if I could get to the edge of the curb, I'd not be able to go between the curb and the street. So lack of the ramp, the lack of a hard surface means this alternate route is not accessible either. And these are the sorts of things we'll talk about in the session today.
Ron, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. There was a question in the chat room.
Sure.
Okay. What do you know about the recent ruling in NYC for the visibly impaired and pedestrian traffic signals, and how will that affect the rest of us?
Great question. I do know something about it. Can I delay that to the end if we have time? Because that dealt with the accessible pedestrian signals and not specifically with temporary traffic control. But if we have time, I'd like to talk about that at the end. But that dealt with signals in general, not specifically with temporary traffic control. But good question.
Okay, we'll ask it again at the end. Thank you.
You're welcome. So to be accessible, the temporary route has to comply with the requirements for what's called the PAR, the pedestrian access route. And we don't really have time to go into all of these. We have courses, half-day and full-day courses that go into detail on that. But basically, the path has to have sufficient width. PROAG calls for 4 feet. I know there's some agencies in the region here that call for 5 feet, which is great. The maximum cross slope is 2%. The surface has to be firm, stable, and slip resistant. And then there's requirements for vertical discontinuities and protruding objects. In accommodating pedestrians, we need to consider the type of work that's being performed, the duration of the work, and then what are the hazards and impediments that that work is going to create for pedestrians. Some of you may have attended Adam Weiser's session yesterday on work zones, and notice he was talking about roadway work zones for vehicular traffic, but he also emphasized the importance of looking at and considering the duration of work and the type of work being performed. But now, since we're on the sidewalk or in a crosswalk, we also have to consider what sort of hazards and barriers will that work create for pedestrians. Let's take a simple case. Let's say we have a temporary traffic control zone where we have a work crew and the work's just going to last a few hours, maybe an hour and a half to a few hours. So what we should do is determine how pedestrians are going to be affected by that work activity. Maybe as part of the sidewalk closed, but there's a path available for pedestrians. It's going to depend obviously on your specific situation. And then establish a plan for how members of that crew are going to assist pedestrians, especially pedestrians with vision impairments or mobility disabilities, in negotiating that work area. And then identify somebody on that crew to watch for pedestrians and initiate the plan if the need or when the need arises. So it's pretty straightforward. Obviously, though, that someone that you identify to watch for pedestrians should not be the flagger, right? Flagging in the roadway is a full-time job as I look at it. We don't want that individual to also have to look out for pedestrians. But what if that temporary traffic control zone is left in place overnight or for several days? That, of course, often happens, and you don't have workers present at all times. Then we have to have more extensive measures to accommodate pedestrians. But remember, they have to be accommodated throughout the entire work zone or temporary traffic control zone. What are some approaches to routing pedestrians? I'd like to look at the 3 that we're going to focus on. But I also want to point out, remember, kind of first and foremost consideration in these efforts should be for safety of the pedestrians and the workers. I think even DOJ would agree that safety takes precedence over accessibility. Safety should be a primary consideration. These are the 3 approaches we might use. The first one, and the most desirable one, would be, if we can do it, to maintain the existing pedestrian pathways if the sidewalk can remain open during construction. The path might be narrowed, the path might have to shift to one side of the sidewalk or something like that. Might have a different surface. Maybe we have a steel plate or wood planks or something over a part of the walkway, but we maintain basically the existing pathway. That may not be possible. Then we think about, can we develop an alternate pathway that's easily reached from the current pathway, like maybe detour pedestrians into what had been the parking lane along the street and have some sort of devices between the pedestrians and vehicular traffic. If we can't do that, then we may need to develop some sort of a detour path, like maybe to the other side of the street, like that situation I showed you in New Orleans. There, both the sidewalk and the parking lane basically were occupied by construction-related activities or equipment or materials. So there we have to have maybe a more extensive detour route to take people to the other side of the street for a block or two, and then back to the original sidewalk section. So you have to consider which of these approaches applies to your particular job or activity. The alternate pedestrian access route I mentioned has to be accessible. So it has to comply with the requirements for the PAR in PROAG. Notice what PROAG says about it. A couple things anyway. Should be provided on the same side of the street as the disrupted route to the maximum extent feasible. And then also note where pedestrians are exposed to adjacent construction, traffic, or other hazards, they shall be protected with a barricade or channelizing device. So we'll look at some examples of that. These are some of the components of an accessible, detectable temporary path, and we'll look at each of these, but it includes what's called detectable edging, channelizing devices, the pathway width and surface is a key part of that, and that may involve temporary ramps, temporary curb ramps, for example. There may be sidewalk closures. How do we handle those? And we may need, in some cases, audible devices to get information to the visually impaired. And one thing I do want to note, this is sort of a pet peeve of mine. I see this all over the country, but we should not be using this yellow caution tape or rope or other things strung between devices, mainly because they are not detectable. An individual with a cane or low vision pedestrian cannot detect these things, and so we should not be using them. Although it's like to say, it's people maybe think this tape has sort of supernatural powers that'll prevent people from entering an area, but that's not the case. And in fact, usually, in my experience, usually you find the tape on the ground after a few hours, where it's even more useless than it was originally. Detectable edging should be provided throughout the entire length of the pedestrian path so that the visually impaired pedestrian can find their way through the length of the facility. Notice it should protrude at least 6 inches above the surface, with the bottom of the edging a maximum of 2.5 inches above the surface. And it should be firmly attached to the ground or to other devices. And these can be things like sections of plastic or metal or wood or formed in place concrete curb, as long as it's detectable with the cane and complies with the criteria you see here. Here's a couple examples. Let's take the one on the left first. This looks like it's about 5 feet wide. So in terms of the width of the pathway, that looks okay. Assuming this lumber here, assuming that's 6 inches high and assuming this is firmly attached, that should be okay. That should comply with what I just talked about. This netting might be an issue here. If it's kept taut, I think it's probably okay, but maybe, I think we've all probably seen where that netting may start to sag a little bit. In that case, there's the potential for the tip of a cane to get kind of caught up or wrapped up in that netting, which is not good. So if you're going to use this, make sure that stays taut so it's not a issue for someone using a cane. And how about the one here on the right? This looks like it's 5 or maybe even more feet wide, but I don't think this kick plate or toe board here is 6 inches high. I don't know what you all feel, but to me, that's not high enough. And this is a good example too. Let's say there was an 8-inch high board here. That would comply with PROAG, but does that comply with good construction safety practices? So I want to emphasize PROAG is an accessibility guideline. It's not a safety guideline. It's still up to us to use our training and experience and knowledge to design and build in safety into these features. I don't know about you, but to me, this would be unacceptable. I mean, a child could get into that work area. There's really no separation. I'd certainly want to do more here to separate the work area from the sidewalk. But if this was an 8-inch high board here, that would be compliant with PROAG, but certainly not with safety criteria. Channelizing devices, they also need to be detectable. Notice they need detectable, continuous detectable bottom and top surfaces. The top surfaces is for what's called hand trailing, meaning if you're watching me, the visually impaired pedestrian might put their hand around the rail or a board or something and trail as they walk along. That's called hand trailing. That's a form of helping them guide them through the work area. And notice with channelizing devices, the bottom of the bottom surface must be no higher than 2 inches above the ground, and the top of the top surface no lower than 32 inches above the ground. And here are a couple examples of compliant channelizing devices. And notice that they do comply with the criteria I just indicated. Couple notes about longitudinal channelizing devices, and you see another example in the image here. These have not met the crashworthy requirements for temporary traffic barriers, so we shouldn't be using these to shield obstacles or provide positive protection for pedestrians or workers. They are pedestrian channelizing devices. They're not traffic barriers. But here, to distinguish from them, this would be an example of the temporary traffic barriers. These are designed to help prevent penetration by vehicles and minimizing injuries to pedestrians, also to workers, obviously, and to the vehicle occupants. So temporary traffic barriers, like you see here, need to be crashworthy. And a couple examples to illustrate this. Some of you might recognize this. My apologies to the MUTCD. This is typical application 28, but so it would fit on the slide a little better, I rotated it. But this is from the MUTCD, and the reason I've included this is sometimes in teaching my normal half-day class in this, people will point to this typical application 28 and they'll say, these are temporary traffic barriers here. And that's not correct. These are simply those channelizing devices I mentioned. They are not traffic barriers. But notice the channelizers, I think, are appropriate here. This looks like it's a downtown kind of environment, 1 lane per direction, probably low speed. So the channelizers are appropriate, in my opinion. Here's another example. This comes from the Minnesota DOT's temporary traffic manual. Notice the sidewalk is closed. There's some construction here, and there's a minor road or maybe an alley here. And notice this is a low-speed roadway, 1 lane per direction. Same sort of thing. Notice they're using channelizers to direct the pedestrians into what had been the parking lane. There's a temporary curb ramp here. And at the alley or at this minor road, because there's no curb here, we need to use detectable warning surfaces here, and then pedestrians kind of repeat the path in the opposite direction on the other side of the street. But because this is a low-speed roadway, they're using channelizers on both sides of this pedestrian path. But now this is also from Minnesota DOT. Notice this is a higher speed roadway or a multi-lane low-speed roadway. And now the device facing traffic here, or on the traffic side, this is a temporary traffic barrier. This is a crash-worthy device. In fact, notice we're using the impact attenuators at the end here for roadside safety. But on the building side, or in the inside of this pathway, we are using channelizers. And of course, we still have the temporary ramps because we're detouring pedestrians into what had been the parking lane. I took this in Minneapolis a couple of years ago. I was there for a conference. I don't know any of the history, but obviously on the left, you can see there's a high-rise building going up. And originally, you can see they had the temporary traffic barriers here, which are a detectable edging, also crash-worthy device. But I don't know whether they had to get a crane in here to do some lifting, or whether a flatbed maybe was parked here while a crane on site lifted some panels or something off of the truck. I mean, of course, that happens during construction. But what bothers me is the way they left this. And maybe another flatbed's coming back in the morning with more materials. I don't know. But would we agree this is not a detectable situation right now with those tubular markers? So to me, at a very least, they should have tried to put in maybe some channelizers in there. Maybe not crash worthy, but at least they would have been detectable. And you can see at the bottom here, part of the temporary ramp that gets people from the sidewalk to the street level. Surfaces are important. Needs to be non-slip, desirably should be smooth, and it needs to be able to support a wheelchair under all conditions. So this scene on the left here, that bare earth will not be able to support a wheelchair or certain walkers or crutches under all conditions. And then we need to pay attention to the little things like even drainage. I took this in Washington, D.C. in January. I was there for a conference. Generally, they had this done correctly. Notice they have the temporary traffic barriers here, they have the curb ramp, but notice the detail of the drainage and the ponded water here creates issues really for both able-bodied and disabled pedestrians. I mentioned temporary curb ramps should be strong enough to support the weight of not only pedestrians, but also motorized scooters and wheelchairs, and desirably should have some sort of marked edge so that they're noticeable by sighted pedestrians so that they don't maybe trip and fall off of the side of the ramp. The transitions are important so that a wheelchair can get onto and off the ramp easily. There shouldn't be a vertical surface. And of course, they need to have sufficient turning space so wheelchairs can turn on and off of the ramps. Here's a couple examples. Let's take the one on the right first. This is sort of a homemade ramp, and that's fine. Notice on the back side here and here, there's a railing, which is also probably not a bad idea. But the problem with those railings is those create what's called a constrained condition for a wheelchair, meaning the footrest of the wheelchair cannot extend beyond the ramp. And my concern here is I think this is a 4 foot by 4 foot turning space at the top of the ramp. And with a constrained condition with those rails, that is not sufficient for turning. With a constrained condition, the turning space would need to be 5 by 5. So I think that has inadequate turning space. How about the one on the left? Look at this ramp. An able-bodied pedestrian like me, I don't think I'd want to step on that ramp. Notice how it's warped. Terrible transition here. Probably no wheeled device can really get on that ramp. Looks kind of flimsy. This is Scott Windley of the Access Board. This is just a demo. He's not going to travel over that ramp. But the point I want to make is a few years ago, Scott told me the batteries alone in his power chair here weigh 400 pounds. So if you add that to the weight of the chair and Scott's weight as an individual, you're talking many hundreds of pounds. And so your temporary ramps have to support several hundred pounds. And I don't think that one's going to do it. A better idea, and I'm not trying to promote a particular product or anything, but are these temporary modular ramps that fold up and can be reused. But notice they're 5 feet wide. They have a railing. They have a detectable edge here, a toe board or kick plate at the bottom. They have some slip resistance built into the texture. These are hinged here and here, so they fold down, and so there's a good transition onto and off of the ramp. And as I said, these can be used over and over again.
Ron, there's another question in the chat room.
Sure.
In your travels, would you say road agencies are improving with work zone accessibility generally, or do substantial problems persist? If the latter, what do you think the medium to long-term liabilities are for local agencies?
Great questions. And this is just my perception. My perception is that I think things are slowly getting better, but I still am continuously, and remember, I'm a traffic engineering professional, so I may be more judgmental or stricter in my sort of assessment, but I think we still have a long way to go. I still see, even this summer, I didn't travel that much, obviously, due to the pandemic, but in my limited travels, I still saw way too much yellow caution tape around, and some places where there were no access, no alternate routes and that sort of thing. So I think we still have a long way to go. And Carl, could you repeat the last part of the question about, was it liability?
Yeah, sure. So if the latter, what do you think the medium to long-term liabilities are for local agencies?
Yeah, I think there is some significant liability. The last in-person training I did back in February, I won't identify the city, but they mentioned to me that in their community, and maybe others of you have this as well, that they had a disabled individual who on weekends or in the evenings, during the summertime, would, after a work zone, pedestrian work zone was set up, would go out and take photographs of the things that violated PROAG, and apparently would email those to the municipality and point those out to them. So hopefully that was done in the spirit of maybe, trying to improve things or educate folks, but there is always the potential. If someone can't get to work, for example, or can't get to their pharmacy, or can't get other places they need to go, if nothing is done to kind of correct that situation, there's always the possibility of an ADA actual lawsuit or a complaint to DOJ, and then the consequences can be significant. A good question.
Thank you, Ron. And there's two more that popped up. One person, and it's in relation to the pictures you have right here. The problem with this picture is that they are using channelizing devices to protect from vehicular traffic. And the second is, can drainage pass beneath the temporary modular ramps? Whew, that was a tongue twister.
Oh, I guess maybe there's a little drainage here, but no, I would say probably not. And that may be an issue. Drainage may be an issue. Yeah, and I would agree. I think they're using these as channelizers, and it appears that is a high-speed multi-lane roadway. So I would agree with the comment that, yes, they really should use temporary traffic barriers there. Sidewalk closures. I mentioned that the sidewalk, the MUTCD requires that a barricade detectable by an individual using a cane be placed across the full width of the crosswalk. So for example, on the left here, someone sent me this and asked if this was okay. And I said no. And I said, it needs to be a barricade there. And they said, well, that sign complies with the MUTCD, which is true. But the problem is that sign and its information is not accessible to someone who's blind. So there needs to be a detectable barricade or closure across that sidewalk. You can still use the sign, but there also needs to be something that communicates that information to the visually impaired. And then this one, nice big sign, nice barricade, but they didn't really do it correctly. Notice they're leading pedestrians into the street and no separation between the pedestrian path and the roadway, and apparently no ramp or anything to get someone in a wheelchair, but from the sidewalk to the street. So the device is good, the sign is good, but the rest of the installation was not done correctly. And then where you have more complicated situations in terms of detours, you may need to use communication devices. And these you can see clip onto channelizers or drums, and they can detect motion and then play a recorded message. I kind of like this one on the right. Put it on a channelizer device, and they call this the Pedestrian Information Center that gives the audible information to the visually impaired. Something else to consider too, we wouldn't do this in a roadway project because of course we don't want our flaggers talking with the motorists, but on the sidewalk, it's a different situation. So it's okay to use what's called a guide. This would be an individual, and they can be part of the crew, but part of their responsibility would be to communicate with pedestrians, particularly disabled individuals. And this is probably most appropriate, as I say here, in areas with high concentrations of pedestrians and people with disabilities. This actually is the other end of that project I showed you on Canal Street in New Orleans. And this fellow is supposed to be the guide to keep pedestrians, I guess, from getting into the work area, also to direct them maybe across the street. And that's appropriate. The only criticism I have here is I was here about 10 minutes observing things and taking photographs. And in those 10 minutes, this fellow never turned around to look at pedestrians. Remember, to me, his main focus, if he's a guide, should be on pedestrians and making sure he intercepts or stops or aids pedestrians who need assistance. So the guide needs to be properly trained. Few best practices. I'll probably pick up the pace here to leave some time for questions. Be sure to communicate with the public what you're going to do, when something's going to be closed, what the detour route is. When you have the project laid out or the area laid out, put yourself in the pedestrian's shoes. I mean, think about getting a cane and blindfold or a wheelchair and try to get through the route yourself, or have someone on your staff go through the route. Can they do it? Is it confusing? Is it detectable? Pay attention to phasing and timing of construction. If you're going to detour pedestrians to the other side of the street, you need to be sure that the sidewalk on the other side of the street is accessible. That's what we're showing in the slide there on the left. Don't close both sides, don't close sidewalks on both sides of the street at the same time. It's a sad situation there on the right. It looks like maybe a private development on the right side of the street, and the Public Works Department and the Street Department did their sidewalk repairs on the other side of the street at the same time. Maybe a little bit of communication and coordination could have caused this project to be accelerated before the other project started or delayed after that was started. So at least we had one side of the street open to pedestrian traffic. Just equipment, vehicles, objects or items related to construction materials should not block the sidewalk. I know this landscaping vehicle and trailer here on the right or left is a common problem, but we wouldn't allow them to stop in the lane of traffic here for an hour and a half or 2 hours. We shouldn't allow them to block a sidewalk. In fact, this person probably should get bonus points, right? They block the sidewalk and the bike lane, which to me is unacceptable. I didn't mention it, but DOJ considers curb ramps to be the basic element of accessibility. There should be sort of top priority. And notice here's some work that blocks curb ramps. These are two different locations. In fact, this one here on the right was kind of sad. This was a 3-day weekend in this particular city, and this lift was parked here all weekend, basically blocking that crosswalk. So we need to pay attention to those sorts of things as well. Now, make sure your agency policies regarding temporary traffic control include accessible and detectable pedestrian pathways. Make sure you enforce those policies. And then when you're laying something out, maybe you can't get a 4-foot wide, walkway or path. Maybe you got a utility pole 3 feet from a storefront or something. And so that opening is maybe 3 feet rather than 4 feet. If that's what the best you can do, that would be accessible to the maximum extent feasible, but document that, document why you had to do that, take some photographs. That is a good way to try to reduce your liability exposure. And just a few examples, and then we'll open it up to questions. Here's a detour into the street. This looks like a building project, right? Not a roadway project. The grass furniture zone here, they built a boardwalk over that grass. Grass is not accessible. Have a railing here. Might be good to put a detectable edging here as part of that railing. And they're using temporary traffic barriers here. I commend them for that, but the MUTCD would say they need to be interlocked and continuous, and these don't appear to be interlocked and continuous. There's a curb ramp here, or a ramp. I'm not sure why they didn't sort of square that off. And my concern here is that looks like a pretty good lip there at that piece of plywood. So you might want to have some sort of a beveling or wedge there to make that an easier transition for a wheelchair. This is not an accessible surface, but it's a common sort of issue. The gas company replaced a gas line here. They left it like that. And I think their deal is that they have a contract with a concrete company, and they have 3 weeks after they get notice to come out and put the finished concrete there. Well, one thing to think about is maybe have the gas company who backfilled that, maybe they could put in like sort of a cold mix or something. It's not a good, not a permanent solution, but at least it might be traversable by a wheelchair until the concrete can be placed. This is not a problem that we face. This sign is required by the MUTCD for road work, but now this sidewalk is inaccessible. And I'm not sure, we'd probably have to see more of this street to know how to resolve it, but this is an issue that, of course, we face in public works. And then I think I'll sort of finish with this and just ask yourself, how does your agency handle this? It looks like just 1 or 2 slabs or the sidewalk are being replaced. When I teach this class in person, I show this slide and I ask folks, how long would it take your agency to complete this work? And it's interesting, I get answers anywhere from we do it in 1 day to some agencies have told me they need 7 days to do that. And I don't know how long this was out here before I took this picture, but would you agree you can kind of see a goat path starting to be worn here where the able-bodied folks have walked around that. So again, this is a tough problem. If there's no sidewalk on the other side of the street, if you can't detour pedestrians into the street, how do you handle something like that? And maybe the best way to handle it is to try to speed up your construction to sort of get in and get out as quickly as you can. So we may have a minute or 2 left. Carly, any questions or comments have come in?
All right, so we have the one that you had saved for later, and it's from Patrick Wright out of Pennsylvania. Dr. Eck, what do you know about the recent rulings in New York City for the visibly impaired and pedestrian traffic signals, and how will that affect the rest of us?
Good question. Yeah, thank you, Pat. Yeah, that for those of you not familiar with that, it did not deal with temporary traffic control. It dealt with traffic signals. And I believe New York City has something like 13,000 signals, pedestrian signals. And apparently in the 30 years since ADA was enacted, plus or minus 30 years, I think something like 5% of their signals are APS, meaning accessible pedestrian signals with audible tones and so forth. And there was a recent court ruling, I guess just in the last week or 2, actually what they call a summary judgment ruling. It never even went to trial, but the court said that New York City, in failing to upgrade their signals, was discriminating against the visually impaired. So obviously that's significant. The interesting thing is, as I understand it, it was sort of a 2-part ruling. The first part was what I just told you, The second part, which would be the remedy, which I guess would be the court ordering New York City, telling them what to do, that is still forthcoming. So that has not been issued yet. That's all I have.
Okay, and we are.
Thank you all
That's
for
fine.
participating. You have my email if you'd like to communicate with me.
Great. Thank you so much, Ron.